Okay. Good evening, everyone. Please come and find a place. You're welcome tonight to either sit on chairs or sit on the floor if that's your custom. I'm Rabbi Feinstein. Welcome to Valley Beth Shalom. A special welcome to friends from Stephen Weiss Temple and from Adat Ariel. It's good to be together once again. Tonight begins the commemoration of Tisha B'Av, which is just a word of introduction, and then we'll begin our program together. The holidays of the Jewish year are all directed to the theme of redemption. So Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos talk about the redemption of the first generation, those who left Egypt, crossed the desert, met God at Mount Sinai, and arrived in the Promised Land. Purim and Hanukkah represent redemptive experiences in later generations. That's what the Jewish year is for. It is a rehearsal for redemption. It is a celebration of redemption. Now, what do you do with all the other days? This is a people that is known, as you well know, more persecution, oppression, more pain than any people on earth. So how do you commemorate that if the theme of the Jewish year is redemption, is salvation? And so the Jewish people did a very interesting thing. We took all the days and put them on one day, and then put them on an obscure day in the middle of the summer. And that's a very interesting decision. I mean, it could have been the other way around. We could have had a day to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. We could have had a week to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. We could have days to commemorate each of the destructions and exiles and inquisitions and persecutions and destructions. We could have had days all through the year, and that would have filled up an entire Jewish year. But then we would have been a different people, a people that commemorates day after day after day its victimhood. Would not have been a people that prays for redemption every day. Would not have been a people that expects redemption. And so the Jewish community did something, I think, remarkably wise, remarkably chutzpahdik, remarkably gutsy. They took all the destructive days and put them on one day. Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, which is tonight. Made it a fast day so that we concentrate the mind and the heart. Demanded that we read the book of Eicha, a Megillah, a scroll at the end of the Hebrew Bible, which is an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem the first time, and ask us to sit and reflect on what it means to be the heir, to be the one who has received this long history of oppression. And more than that, as we'll do tonight with wonderful teachers, the question of how it was that this people did not succumb, did not fall apart. I mean, if you think about this, it's a remarkable thing. A people is defined by its connection to land, to culture, to language, to custom. Take two of those things away, what happens to that people's identity? That's why the Assyrians exiled the 10 lost tribes. That's why the Assyrians exiled the people of Judea, of Jerusalem. And the book of Psalms reflects this. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept as we remembered Zion. And 2 lines down in that psalm it says, how can we sing a song of Zion? How can we sing a song of redemption on foreign soil? But they figured out how to do that. And that's the great miracle of this day. If you want something to celebrate, that's what we celebrate this day. This remarkable cultural and spiritual resilience of this people to experience so much oppression and so much destruction, and to not let it destroy the expectation, anticipation of redemption that is so at the heart of Jewish life. So tonight we're going to pray quickly through the Mariv prayers led by Cantor Fox, and then we're going to learn Rabbi Laufer from Stephen Weiss Temple, Rabbi Schildenfried, newly from Adat Ariel, liberated from the South Bay and brought up here to the heavenly reaches of North Hollywood, California. We're so delighted to have you in the community now, Brian. Welcome. Welcome. I'll be a little teaching as well. And then we'll sit together and we'll learn Eicha. We'll learn that wonderful book that reflects on the catastrophe of the destruction of Yerushalayim. If you have one of the red books, we're going to be in Mariv. We'll be doing Mariv, which you find on page, I don't exactly know.
Page 137.
There you go. Please rise.
וירחום יכפר עוון ולא ישחית, מרבה לישיבה פה ולא יאיר, ולא יאיר כל חמתו. אדוני יושיע מלך יעננו ויום קוראנו, ברכו את אדוני המבורך. ברוך אדוני יברך לעולם ועד, ברוך אדוני אשר בדברים הרבים בחוכמה ובשיח שלו. בואי ליום ולילה מלך חי וקיים, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב הרבים. אבא סוילו בישראל סוילו סך בישראל ימי חיינו ואורך יומנו ובאמנך יום ולילה ועבדך תשים ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני עולמו ישראל, שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. לא יום שמע יתשבו ותשא ישנו יחיבצה. Jammerchem ben jift lewavig. O yemer o shelay moyer. Nabel ben Israel man. Man diese was ist sei wie sind gedoischen. Adonai Elohechem Hamed Hamed v'imanu kazoi zekeim alinu. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ובני ישראל הכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ויאמרו כולם מי יחמוך פעילים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורא תהילות כל ספל מלכות חרה ובונך בוקי הים לפני משה זה עלינו ויאמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם מבואר ונאמר כיפרדו אדוני את יעקב וגאלו ביד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני גואל ישראל. אשכבין אדוני נמצא ויגל בדי ושמור את צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום יטוב יד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני שומר עמו ישראל לעד. ברוך אני למורים ברבי ששיים הללויה. Viladino ilasis eschelelo. Shayanil. כי המלכות שלך היא, ולעולמי תמלוא בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו, תמיד ימלוך עלינו, תמיד ימלוך עלינו, לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו. גדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, וילמד יברך אלוהיו וימלך מלכותיו חייכם ומכם וחיינו בית ישראל, בגלל ובקורי ואמרו אמן יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם ולעולם יבוא. יבורך וישתבח ויתבואר, ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתהלל שמי קודשו בריחו. לעולם אין כל ברכתו ושירתו, תושבחתו ונחמתו, גם ירן ביעלם בה, ויאמרו אמן. סלח לנו אבינו, ראינו ונראה ורבנו, שינו יסינו יתחילו If you haven't completed the Amidah, take your time and finish. We're on page 149. ישתבח ויתבואר ויתרומם ונשיא מדלן ויתעלה ויתעלל שמי קודשה וריחו לילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ורחמתה דמיונון ביומה ממהרו אמן. תתקבל צלותנו ואותנו כל ישראל כל הנשמעים ממהרו אמן. שלום רבה מן שמעיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ממהרו אמן. יהי שלום רבה עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עלינו לשבח לדון הכל לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית שלא עשינו גילויי ארצות ולא שמענו כמשפחות האדמה שלא שם חלקנו כבר וגמר עלינו כל עוונם פועלים ומשתחווים ופועלים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים קדוש ברוך הוא שהוא נטע שמיים ויוסד הארץ נושא יקרא בשמיים ממעל שכינתו זו ושכינתו זו בגובה מרומים הוא אלוהינו ובינוד אמר מלכנו וזולתו ככתוב בתורתו וידעתו היום וישיבו אותה אל לבבך כי אדוני הוא האלוהים הארץ בתוכת אין עוד על כן יקבל לכו עלינו. You may be seated with the mourners. Anyone saying Kaddish, please remain standing. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני מלוך לעולם, ועת ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא. יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו ושם אחד. Mourner's Kaddish, page 151. Together slowly. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה. וילמד יברך חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחיי חון וביומי חון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Amen. Shkoach Cantor. I think we can gather up the books and put them away. So if anyone wants to gather them, put them, hand them over, and we can put them away. Well, if there's anything that kept the Jewish people alive through all of these catastrophes, it is this deep commitment to learning. So tonight, before we read Echa and commemorate the destructions that have befallen our people, we're going to do a little bit of learning. And it's a great joy. During the summertime, things are a little more relaxed and a little easier. And so it's a great joy to gather communities together and ask rabbis who are friends and neighbors to come and join us. So we'll first learn with Rabbi Sari Laufer of Stephen Weiss Temple, and then Rabbi Brian Schuldenfrei of Adat Ariel. So Rabbi Laufer, you're up first.
So Shavuot Tov, I brought source sheets. I don't know that you really need them. I'll take us through some texts. And I want to start by saying, so first of all, hello, especially if you joined us at WISE last night. You'll recognize at least a couple of the texts and the questions. But I also want to honor that for me in particular, and maybe for some others in this room, I actually found it a really hard question this year. How do we rebuild after catastrophe? And so I will say thank you for having us as a community, and particularly for having me. And I will say that as many of you know, in the Reform movement, we have everyone stand for Kaddish Yatom, and I've always, thought that was a nice and meaningful moment. But I am a mourner this year, and I found it actually quite profound to be here to say Kaddish, so thank you for that. But I also think that maybe that's why I found it such a hard question this year. I'm in Shana for my father, and that question of how do you rebuild after catastrophe just seems hard when you also sort of feel like you're in the middle of catastrophe. And so I think there's a lot to be said about the question of sort of what do we do on the 10th of Av, but I think there's also a lot to be said for, sitting in the 9th of Av. So I'm going to teach B'Shem Umrot, in the name of a couple of teachers with whom I had the honor of learning this year. First is someone, and I recommend, depending on your Tisha B'Av practice, I would say I think this actually falls into the category of permitted learning. There's a woman named Nora McInerney, who has written a number of books on grief. She would call herself, I think, sort of a professional mourner. She has a remarkable story and a profound wit and empathy, and I really do recommend, if nothing else, to watch her TED Talk at some point during Tisha B'Av. I actually think it's really profound Tisha B'Av learning. And so I'm going to give you the thesis of her TED Talk, which is not giving anything away because it's right there on the website when you go to it. But her thesis is we don't move on from grief, we move forward with it. And so I want to sort of offer that as the foundation for this teaching. And I'm going to take us, I think I'm actually just going to have us look at the first two texts together. And then the last one, you can take home and think about. So the first one I will teach both B'Shem Umrah. I had the real gift. I'm trying to remember, Rabbi Schuldenfrei, if you were on that webinar also, but there was Rabbi Tali Adler with the Hadar Institute gave a gorgeous 3-session learning that she called the Torah of Reopening. And it was, I told her this actually, that I have probably turned to that teaching more than anything else in the last several months. Though the first text that we're going to look at, I first learned he'll laugh when I gave him that title, with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer in Jerusalem. Actually, I believe we learned it on Rosh Chodesh Av many years ago now. And so this is from Maimonides, from Mishnah Torah on Hilchot Avel, the laws of mourning. And not surprisingly, since Maimonides is not always known for his, shall we say, equanimity. He's not always, the softest. He's quite blunt of what he thinks. Al yitkashe adam al meto yoter midai. One should not grieve too much over one's deceased relative. As it is written, right? We have a quote from Jeremiah. Weep not for him who is dead, wail not over him. That is, klomar, yater midai shezeu minhago shel olam. Right? Don't weep too much because, in the words of Nora McInerney, right, everyone you love has a 100% chance of dying. Right? We all do. So don't weep too much because it's the way of the world. That is just what happens. That is part of being a human in the world. And then he goes on to say that the one who grieves too much over what is bound to happen, harei zeh tipeish, that person's a fool, right? How can you be so sad when you knew it was going to happen? Right? From the minute, the only thing we know, right? Death and taxes. So from the minute we are born, we know that this is going to happen. How can you be so naive or idealistic that you're so overwrought? Goes on to say, so what measure of mourning, like Ele Ketzad Ya'atzeh, what's good enough, right? So this fascinating balance of, what is too much, and I guess maybe the parallel question that he's not asking, what's not enough? This idea that there is somehow the perfect measure of mourning. And so here we go. You are allowed to weep for 3 days, shlosha livchi. You can cry for 3 days. Shiva lahesped, you can eulogize or lament for 7 days. And you've got 30 days that you don't have to get your hair cut, and the other 5 things, right? The 5 things that we honor today also. So I want to open it up. I can't see you if you're watching on Facebook, but I always say throw your question in the chat. Maybe we'll get to see it later. But any thoughts on this text? Any reactions? You can cry for 3 days. I just sort of asked the reactions to this text. Oh, she asked is the real mourning only for 3 days? Right, by the way, spoiler alert, right, for a parent you do get some extra time. You don't have to be done after 30 days for a parent. Right, but this idea that, you're supposed to, I don't know, I'll save judgment for the end of that sentence. I'm not sure if you're supposed to move on or not. Nora would say no. Great. So for those who are watching at home or couldn't hear, right, this idea that, and I would agree from this year, right, that the rituals of Jewish mourning, right, that you have Shiva, and every part of your being might be saying, I'm not ready, right? Like I am not ready to get up. I'm not ready to leave this space, but you do it because that is what, right, tradition says. And at the end of Shloshim, you may say, like, I'm not ready. So I would actually argue that maybe, I'm not sure if Maimonides would agree, but I think you're right that there's something in the sort of fake it till you make it of the Jewish church, right? I'm going to get up and I'm going to act as if. I'm going to act ke'ilu. And I'm going to have to re-enter the world. So, at least I have these markers, these moments, sort of these boundaries with which I can re-enter the world. I want to say I'm going to quote many a therapist who has said, not to me, not that many therapists, but that I've heard therapists say in general, right, like, don't should on yourself. I will confess, like, there's been a lot, I had this moment, of should I be going back to work yet? Should I this? And to some extent, right, like you asked the question, like, so 3 days, right, like, I can't tell my body, like, okay, you can't cry anymore, right? Like, it's only been 3 days. But I think there is that the push and pull of returning, and I'm going to put that in quotes, sort of returning to life as it was. And I put that in quotes because I don't think, and that's the comment from Rabbi Adler that I'm going to share in a moment, right? I don't think there is a returning to life as it was. I think that's a lesson certainly of this past 15 months, and I think it's a lesson of Tisha B'Av, right? You return to life as it is now. And so what Rabbi Adler says that I love, there's a need to embrace the real possibilities that our return offers, to enrich the experience in ways that would not have even been conceivable before the period of absence, right? She was specifically talking about sort of the return now, but I'm thinking about finishing Shiva or finishing Shloshim. You look at the world differently, and maybe there's enriched experiences, and then there's certainly ones that feel lacking, but they were not conceivable before, right? So there's a sense of the world that you conceive it differently, and that can be a realization, I think, of like really profound loss, right? I am seeing the world in a way I never would have seen it before, and that is profoundly painful. Or I'm seeing the world in a way that I never would before, and like maybe there's possibility in that, and maybe I'm holding both of those things at the same time. Any other thoughts on this first text? Absolutely. So, and I think it's actually, and I'm sorry, I don't know both of your names, but these two ladies said, right, like I think there's very much a difference. And I think even Maimonides, I'm going to give him the credit. I think he would even recognize, right, that there might be a disconnect between my actions and my inner life, right? And I think any of us, I'm looking at this room, any of us who have grieved know, like, I might be back at work and like, I hope if any of you are like neurosurgeons or anything in that, like you were very focused in whatever work you were doing. But for some of us, you're back at work, but you're not totally back, right? I think it's a lot of that push and pull of exactly what you said. That sort of the tradition says I'm going to re-enter the world at this sort of with this boundary, and then a further boundary, and then a further boundary. But my emotional life doesn't necessarily meet those milestones exactly. And I think the idea being that that's okay as long as you are also engaging with the world, right? I think what Maimonides, even back then, was, and we've seen it, and maybe we've been it, right? People who can't get back to the world at all, and that's an additional loss, right? And I think he's sort of trying to protect against that. So I want to look at a second text, and then I'm going to turn it over to an old friend, longtime friend. We can't say old friend anymore, Brian. We've passed that. So this is a text I actually first learned from Rabbi Ann Brenner and have loved ever since. It's from one of the minor tractates Machot. And again, I think it asks this question of sort of how do we re-enter society, right? How do we rebuild? Which for me, the question is sort of like, how do we go back into the world? So on the first and second day of mourning, one may not enter the Temple Mount. And on the third day, one may enter, but must go around to the left. Right? So there's this immediate, I want to say two things. When I talk to mourners about Kriya, right, I talk about sort of the external manifestation and the internal. I think that's happening here too. Right? If everyone else is going around to the right, and you are going around to the left, it sort of forms two functions, one of which the text talks about, and one that I don't think the text talks about, right? The one that the text is going to talk about is it means that everyone's going to look at you and say, well, I hope with curiosity and empathy and gentleness, ask, what happened, right? Why are you going around that way? I think the other piece is it matches the emotional sort of upheaval, right? When you feel like I'm not quite on my feet, I'm not steady, right? To go out of your routine, right? It shakes you up. I mean, think about any time if you've ever like missed a turn because you were really focusing on a podcast, right? Anything that happens and you're sort of like shaken off your routine is jarring. And so I think there's that internal, I am already jarred, and now my physicality matches that. So then the text goes on to say, these are the ones who have to go around to the left. It's an interesting grouping, by the way. A mourner, someone who has been excommunicated, menudeh, one who has a sick person in their house, and one who has lost an object. Okay? So I actually would argue that those are all people who are off kilter. Right? And so again, like their physicality, their physical action is matching that sense of being off kilter. And then again, when asked, and I actually sort of love the idea, I mean, maybe they just knew Jews and we ask questions, but I also think I love this idea that someone is going to notice, right? Like, and I'm going back to, right, when you say Kadishat Home, like you notice who's standing. And so this idea, right, like someone notices that I'm going around to the left. Maybe it's the person that I usually take my morning Temple Mount constitutional with. And they see like, oh, you're over there, right? Or someone I only see on the Temple Mount, right, who notices like, oh, you're over there. And they're going to ask, I hope, again, with empathy, why do you go around to the left? And then I have to answer, right, because I'm a mourner. I now need to, I either need to or I get to share my story. I get to share my experience of catastrophe, right? Not communal catastrophe, but my own. And I think this is like the beautiful moment, right? That then you're supposed to say, may the one who dwells in this house, may the one who dwells in this house comfort you, right? So it gives both the opportunity, I get to share my story, I get to sort of stand in my experience and be seen, and it gives someone else the chance to be a comforter. Right, so there's this, to me, it's this beautiful moment of maybe this time actually like my inner experience is actually matching my outer, right? I'm not forced into anything, but that's actually like it for me, it sort of feels like a mirror. So I'm gonna turn it over in one moment. First, I wanna ask if there's any reactions to this text. You can read the rest, but I really wanted to focus on that one. I think because of the topic of the day. So what I will close with is a question from Dr. Betsy Stone, who's an expert on trauma, and particularly on what she terms I don't think she's the only one who terms it this, but terms post-traumatic growth. And she asks, a critical question here is, how have we or they been changed by the experience of exile, of loss, and mourning? And then this is the one I think that starts to get to the question, right, of how do we rebuild? What of these changes are we going to maintain? How will we keep what we have learned? And so I just want to say, like, for any of us who feel like we are walking around to the left right now, right? We are a mourner, we have someone in our home who's sick, we feel distant or separated from our community, or we've like lost something precious to us. Right? If we feel like we are going around to the left, I think the message here is we know eventually we're going to go back to the right? We're going to get to go the way we're used to going. We're going to get to re-enter the world. But this question of how does the experience of going the other way, how does it shape me? And how do I carry it into the world? And how do I use that to answer this question of how do we go on to rebuild? So I want to thank you all. I'm going to turn it over to my old friend.
Wow. Little cleaner thingies here. Great. So first of all, good evening, everybody. I'm Brian Schulden-Frey, and I am the new rabbi, one of the rabbis at Adat Ariel Synagogue. And it's wonderful to be here. I want to thank Rabbi Feinsteins, and Valley Beth Shalom. My wife is on staff here, so it feels very good to be here. It also feels great to see old friends from Sinai Temple as well, and new friends from Adat Ariel. So I just started my job about 2 weeks ago when I get an email from Rabbi Feinstein saying, for Tisha B'Av, let's discuss how the Jewish people rebuild after catastrophe. And all of my books are in boxes, and I have no internet connection. And Rabbi Feinstein's asking a lofty question about how do we rebuild after catastrophe, and I'm thinking I don't even know where the light switch is in this building, so never mind where all of my books are and how I can possibly answer a question. So I go down to the shul, and I grab a chumash, I grab the Eitz Chaim, and I said, I'm going to make it work from this book and this book alone. And so what I came up with, it was the parsha for that morning. We were reading towards the end of the book of Numbers. In the end of the book of Numbers, and we'll get there in just a second, I came across something which is a rabbinic hermeneutic. That's a fancy way of saying the way the rabbis read the text, right? The way the rabbis engage the Torah. They have different ways of looking at our tradition that inform their way of interpretation. And one of those ways is called something called smichut parshiot, which is a fancy way for saying that what happens around something else influences the way you see that thing. Now, if you didn't follow me, I'm going to give you a practical example from a longtime friend. Sari Laffer and I first met each other in Jerusalem. I was studying at Machon Schechter, and she was a Hebrew Union College student. And we both were fans of the New York Giants. And so, I know there was a bit of an applause. So the season was about to kick off, and Sari had a TV with cable in her apartment, which is something that I did not have. And when the season kicked off, Sari was nice enough to invite a whole group of people over her apartment to watch the opening night game. It was the New York Giants versus the Denver Broncos. And the Denver Broncos were opening this new fancy stadium, and the Giants had just come off a Super Bowl appearance the year before. So Sari invites us all over. The game starts at like 2 o'clock in the morning in Jerusalem, and we all stay there, and Sari made food. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. I go home that night. I fall asleep, and I got to confess I was a little late getting up the next morning. And when I finally settled in to continue my studies, the phone rings, and it's Sari. And Sari says, "You know, Brian, get yourself in front of a TV. You have to see what happens." And it was from Sari Laffer that I learned about 9/11. And so I included a headline in this handout that we'll get to in a little bit of the newspaper that morning, the New York Times from that morning. Smichut Parshiot is, I never think of 9/11 without thinking of Sari Laffer. Those two events are fused, and the sort of the emotional components of that we can unpack later, or maybe I could do that with a therapist or something. But I never think of 9/11 without thinking of Sari Laffer, or that giant football game the night before in Jerusalem. Smichut Parshiot means that whatever happened around one event infuses the way that we look at that event. And so what I'd like to do is to approach the question that Rabbi Feinstein asked, this lofty, beautiful question, and my one book from Smichut Parshiot. Let me give you another example of Smichut Parshiot, one that's a little less self-indulgent and manipulative, and that's from the book of Genesis, right? When Sarah dies, right? It's Parshat Chayei Sarah. When Sarah dies, the text doesn't tell us. It tells us that she lived 127 years, and it's a beautiful life, and the commentators enjoy talking about that. It doesn't say why she died or what happened. So according to Smichut Parshiot, the juxtaposition of the text, what happened immediately before Sarah's passing? Does anyone remember? The Akedah. Sarah dies in the beginning of chapter 23, and the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is chapter 22. So some commentators imagine that it's the grief of that encounter, that when Sarah learns what her husband did to her son on that mountain on that day, she's overcome with grief and she passes away. That's Smichut Parshiot. You look at Sarah's death in context of what happened before to fully understand it. Smichut Parshiot. So again, without any books in hand and a lofty question from Rabbi Feinstein, I try to employ Smichut Parshiot to answer the question of how the Jewish people rebuild after a catastrophe. And now, if you could, thank you. Thank you. So we're on page of my handout, page 5. Page 5 in the handout. towards the end of the book of, thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi Laffer. I know we're less formal. Sari, Brian, Rabbi Laffer, Rabbi Schulten, Friday. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Jonah. Okay, does everyone have a handout? We're on page 5. Everything that I explained, there's little pictures and up to that point. It's the end of the book of Numbers. And a terrible thing happens. It's the incident of Baal Peor, which is, does anyone, a recollection? What happened with Baal Peor at the end of Numbers with the Midianite women? What happened when the Israelites encounter Midianite women? What happens? There's quite an incident that's not appropriate for younger company, let's just say. Let's just say there's a liaison of a sophisticated but crass encounter. And the people, the Israelites, sort of have their eye on, well, it says Moabite women. Are they Moabites? Are they Midianites? We're not going to get caught up in that today. But anyway, the Israelites have their eyes on Moabite women. And God is not happy with that. And there is an enormous plague. And in the midst of this enormous plague, there's a sense that there is a reckoning of what just happened. And in the middle of this reckoning, this communal reckoning, in front of the tent of meeting. So think about this. It would be the equivalent of any one of these incredible communities getting together on Kol Nidre. The Aron HaKodesh is open. The Torahs are there. Everything is pristine. Everything is beautiful. It's a moment of reckoning. And guess what? There's a sexual liaison in front of the entire community. It's incredibly crass. It's incredibly dirty. And then Pinchas, who is one of the head Kohanim, and Joette just did it, takes matters into his own hands. And the couple that engaged in this encounter, he kills them both. That's the incident. And then the text continues. The text continues, page 5. Vayhi acharei hamagefa. And then when the plague was over, and this is actually something that's interesting on page 5 from Numbers 26, you see this, for those of you who read Torah, that's an etnachtah under the word magefa. You see that little like wishbone looking thing under the pay? That's an etnachtah, which symbolizes a sort of like a semicolon break. This is one of the few instances in the Torah where it's called a psikta be'emsa hapasuk, which means that in the middle of the sentence, there's a paragraph break. So if you look at a Sefer Torah, most of the time in a Sefer Torah, a paragraph break wouldn't happen in the middle of a sentence. That's not only true of the Torah, it's also true of most English books. So the Torah is allowing us to know that something is, it's like almost like the Torah is saying, we don't really want to talk about this anymore. Vayhi acharei hamagefa, when the plague was over, when all this had happened, then it goes to the next paragraph. The Lord said to Moses and to the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, Se'u et Rosh, take a census of the whole Israelite community. So here's my question. The Israelite people had just experienced a plague as a result of their going off the derech, of them going off in immoral ways. And then in a communal reckoning, two people desanctify the entire process. And then one man, Pinchas, takes matters into his hands and exacts vigilante justice. That's what just happened. And before we could even swallow, before we could even begin to comprehend what just occurred, God says, after the Magefa, after the plague, what should we do? Se'u et Rosh, let's take a census. Why? Why after this incident, or these incidents, that are so loaded, that are so complicated, that are so fraught with distasteful behaviors, why does God demand of the Jewish people to take a census? It's a rhetorical question. I'm not sure I have the answer. I'm not sure that there is the answer. But let me provide this evening one possible answer, and this is the smichut parshiot that I'm alluding to, or the way of reading the text that I'm alluding to, with the attempt of answering Rabbi Feinstein's question. If you look at Su'u et Rosh in the Hebrew, the translation is take a census of the whole Israelite community. That's a good translation, but it's not a literal translation. If you were to literally translate those words, Su'u et Rosh. What's Rosh? Head. Su'u et Rosh is to lift the head. Lift the head of the Israelite community. After this tragedy, after this magefa, after this intense episode demanding soul searching, God does something that is perhaps unusual. God says, lift the head of the community, meaning after such loss, after such pain, after such tragedy, how do we rebuild? How do we rebuild after the catastrophe? We reinstate dignity. We give people agency. We remind people that they are important and that the life that they have to live is something that is worth pursuing. That in the most difficult hours of our existence, Su'u et Rosh, lift the head. And God recognizes, it really dovetails really well with what Rabbi Lawfar was teaching before from the Rambam about dwelling on mourning. It's almost like God is following the Rambam's advice here and saying, I can't dwell on this. We got to move on. Right? And you, the Jewish people, you've gone off the path. There's your sexual immorality, your sexual depravity. That's a question. Your vigilante justice. That's something that needs to be reckoned with. But right now, the thing that we must do is Su'u et Rosh. We must re-imbue you with, we must gift back to you something that has been lost, which is the gift of dignity, in order that you can march forward. Su'u et Rosh, hold your head up high. And then interestingly, a people that have just been victimized by this plague, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were killed. They're given weapons, they're mobilized, and they're given a purpose for the Jewish people to enter the promised land. Su'u et Rosh, lift up the head. When we're facing tragedy, we give purpose. That's the way that we move on. And I thought about this with the second book that I had out of my box, which was, you can go to the next page. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, there is this incredible archive. It's called the Oneg Shabbos Archive, which is from the Warsaw Ghetto. How many of you are familiar with the Oneg Shabbos? Yeah, many of you. So for those of you who are not familiar, when the Jewish people were confined to the ghetto of Warsaw from the Nazis, Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a historian, recognized that what was happening needed to be documented. And so what he did was he, in a very covert manner, he began to collect materials throughout the Warsaw Ghetto, documenting the Jewish experience there. In other words, he was leaving primary sources for those who would come. In this picture here, these are 2 milk jugs and some other boxes. Within them, the archive contains hundreds of documents of life in the Warsaw Ghetto, and much of what we understand about life in the Warsaw Ghetto is because of Ringelblum's efforts. It was an incredible thing, and that it was incredible that the Nazis never did discover it, and that Ringelblum was able to accomplish that. One of the contributors to the Oneg Shabbos archive was the man on the next page, page 7, Rabbi Kalanimus Kalman Shapira. And Rabbi Shapira was a Hasidic rabbi in Poland before being confined to the ghetto. And he wrote this incredible work. He was an educator, a gifted educator, a powerful Hasidic leader to his community. When he was in the ghetto, he wrote this incredible work called the Eish Kodesh, which means like the holy fire. And what he did was he encountered life in Warsaw, in the ghetto, recognizing the depravity of the Nazis, but dealt with it, like the theology of it, the religion of it. So he didn't walk away from religion, rather he faced it head on. And I think that Rabbi Shapira's teaching here perhaps underscores what we were talking about before. So if I can, I'm going to just read. I want to note that the theology here is one that I find disagreeable, but I think that the point here is a larger point that I'd like to make. So this is Rabbi Shapira. If a person sustains himself in difficult times only with his belief in imminent salvation, then his experience of agony and suffering remain unmitigated, and it is difficult for him to bear when, God forbid, salvation is delayed. In other words, when you think that salvation is going to come, and think if you're in the Warsaw ghetto, and your life has just been torn apart, what Rabbi Shapira is saying is if your expectations are too high, that disappointment can destroy you. Shapira goes on, this is not the case if together with the belief in salvation, he also bows his head saying, he is God and will do what's best in his eyes. This actually softens and absorbs the bitterest feelings and lessens the sting of pain at what is happening. A person is then able to bear more, and his faith has more power to boost his spirits, even when, God forbid, salvation does not come as soon as he had hoped. I don't believe that. I don't believe that God is deciding who is going to make it out of the Warsaw ghetto and who did not. I don't believe that that's the way God functions. But I think what Rabbi Shapira is saying, in addition to that, is that in a way, by recognizing that there are things that are out of your control, it reinstitutes within you agency to live life fully with where you can live that life. In other words, there are all things in our lives. This little thing called coronavirus we're still wearing masks, and for good reason. And we're still struggling with this. And we're not sure what tomorrow is going to bring. We're not sure whether it's safe to do this or to do that. Can we hug this one? Can we embrace that one? We're not sure what it is that we can do. But over the past year and a half, I have seen remarkable achievements from people not trying to wrap their arms around something that was simply out of their jurisdiction, something that coronavirus, but in the little corners of the world that they could affect. They reclaimed agency. They reclaimed their power. And I think that that's perhaps what Rabbi Shapira is suggesting here. Rabbi Shapira is suggesting, look, there are things that we just simply cannot control. We as human beings have this sort of devilish inclination to believe that we can change everything. But reality, or a more mature approach to life, is recognizing that perhaps we're better suited when we look around us and live our lives in front of us. And when what we encounter is what we try and influence. And I think that that's what Rabbi Shapira is saying. And so I'd like to tie the two together. Su'u'et Rosh, that's my prayer for all of us, that we can all hold our heads up high. This past year and a half has been a year of unbelievable challenge with real pain. I mean, I can only imagine losing a parent during all of this. It's been a difficult time. It's going to continue to be a difficult time for a long while. There is a path that we can choose, which is the path of despair, a path of despair that leads us. We say this is all the oy vey path, the woe is me path. But there's something else that we can do. It's not make coronavirus disappear. There is no abracadabra. But there are these small areas of our lives that we can influence, that we can su'u'et Rosh, that we can hold our heads up high after the plague, and that we can once again find blessing. And that's my hope for us and how we can rebuild the world, not even after catastrophe, but in fact in the middle of it. Thank you. Sure. Is there time for a question? Sure. Okay, go, Joe.
Okay, so I heard something on the Pinchas Cosby Zimri relationship, maybe to Tisha, and I want to know what you thought about it. So maybe Cosby and Zimri were not sitting when they had the affair outside of the Mishkan. Maybe they were talking about an intermarriage of a relationship that was once forbidden, that they weren't informed, right? Which is to say, maybe we looked at that not as Pinam as Pinchas did, kind of stabbing them to death, but saying, what if we looked at that again, and now we were going to serve the Jews here, can we talk about another way to come together? This just like they were trying to do.
I love where you're trying to go with it, and I think it's a very good effort. How about that? I think you have beautiful lenses with which you're viewing that incident and the world. I think the text is, so I'll just leave it at that. And I would say to you that this is Jonas Anderson. He's moving as a chaplain to a town in North Carolina next week. He just graduated as a chaplain, and he's moving to North Carolina to a town where there are no other Jews, and he's going to be a chaplain in a hospital for this town, and I think that they are blessed to have you and that beauty of your heart. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, and now to Rabbi Feinstein.
Okay, good evening. Good evening. Thank you to Rabbi Laufer, and thank you to Rabbi Schuldenfrei. I think I'm far enough away that I can take this off. And I hope we get to do this again. I hope, and less sad times, less sad topics. So thank you so much. We'll do one more teaching, if that's okay, and then we'll read Eicha. Everybody okay with that? You're welcome to close your eyes and go to sleep. We'll wake you up before Shacharis, I promise you. In the year 64 BCE, 64 before zero, the Roman Empire comes and takes possession of Judea, of our neck of the woods. And the problem was that Judea was a very, very wealthy province. So the person who got to be the governor of Judea was not a competent administrator. It was the person who bribed the emperor the most to get the job. And that meant that the Romans, who were so adept at governing so much of their empire, were particularly inept at governing Judea. That inept Roman governance, plus the difficulty of governing Jews, which has never been easy, leads to a volatile situation. And a little more than a century later, in the year 67 CE, 67 after zero, the Jews rise up against the Romans. They kill the garrison that is located in Jerusalem and declare their independence. The Romans panic. The Romans panic because they didn't want to lose this wealthy province of Judea. The Romans panic because their empire was already well stretched beyond the capacity to govern it. The Romans panic because this would be an example to people all over the world to rise up against the Romans. And the Romans panic because on the eastern front are the Persians, the Parthian Empire. And without a strong Roman presence in Israel, in Judea, the Persians would just flood into the eastern Mediterranean and steal half of the empire. So the Romans pull their best general, a Spanish bullfighter by the name of Vespasian, out of Spain, and their best legion, the 10th Legion, out of Gaul, and they send them on boats, and they land them in Lebanon, and they march down the coast, killing and pillaging and destroying, and they turn left at Jaffa and come up the coast, and they besiege the city of Jerusalem. On Shvasar B'Tammuz, on the 10th day of the month, on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz, they break through the walls of Jerusalem, and on the 9th day of Av, they reach the core of Jerusalem. They destroy the Holy Temple. Two things about that are interesting. First of all, if you've ever been to Israel, you know that even in a busy day, the walk from the Jaffa gate to the Kotel is about a 10-minute walk. So why did it take the Romans 3 weeks to make that walk? Because that's how brutal the fight was in Jerusalem over every inch of the city. And you can imagine how much blood flowed through the streets of the city. The second thing is it's very unlike a pagan culture, particularly the Romans, who knew how to govern multiple cultures, to destroy the holy place of another people. In paganism, you don't have to do that. Only a monotheist will kill you for your religion. Pagans are, when in Rome, you daven like a Roman. What the pagans wanted to do is simply put their gods in your temple and your gods in their temple, and everybody lives happily ever after. But for the Romans, the Temple of Jerusalem became a symbol of the insurrection, and so it had to be destroyed, and its culture had to be had to be uprooted. And that was the difficult part. Because the Romans then proceeded to make Jewish life in Palestine. They renamed it, by the way, from Judea to Palestine. That's when the renaming took place. So if you want to know when Palestinians were invented, they were invented after the Romans decided that Jews don't live here anymore, even though Jews did live there. The Romans wanted to make Jewish life in Palestine impossible so that we would all leave, on the theory that if we left our land, left our culture, left our language, we would disappear. That was Roman policy. And it worked, more or less. Life became pretty difficult for Jews in Roman Palestine. A century and a half later, there was a messianic movement under a guy named Bar Kokhba and another revolt against the Romans, which just proves to you that Jews just don't get it. And this time the Romans got really mad. They not only destroyed the land and destroyed the revolt, they decided to destroy the rabbis. And this is when the great rabbis of the tradition were martyred, including Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva, who is the embodiment of rabbinic Judaism, is taken out to the Forum of Rome, the Forum in Caesarea. And you should excuse me for this gruesome image. I don't apologize for triggering. But they basically tear the flesh off of his body while he's alive, in front of his students, because they made an example of him, because they wanted people to see what happens if you defy the Romans. There's a story in the Talmud about what happened next, which is the question I asked tonight, and I do appreciate my colleagues bringing their answers. And here's the story in the Talmud about what happened next. The students of Rabbi Akiva gathered to study. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi. And they asked this question: how do you live in the world with the Romans? How do you live in the world with people that brutal? How do you live in the world with a culture that violent? How do you live in the world with such evil? Can you live in the world with such evil? Can you share the world with Nazis? What do you do when Nazis control the world, when the Romans control the world? How do you live in such a world? And there are three answers. Rabbi Yehuda says, how noble are the works of these Romans. They lay out streets, build bridges, erect baths. True, they're barbarians. They are brutal. They are morally corrupt and evil and dark. But damn, are they good engineers. And by the way, it's true. Roman cities are well built, as opposed to Jewish cities, which are not. If you've ever tried to drive through Tel Aviv, you know what I'm talking about. If you ever have a choice, live in a Roman city, it's much better governed than a Jewish city. They built great aqueducts, which are still standing all over Europe. They built great roads, which are the roads of Europe and most of the world where they were. They built great bridges, which are still standing there. Infrastructure was one of the strong points of Roman architecture and Roman engineering. Sorry? Arches. Thank you so much. Right, arches. It's very good. But the question is, can I live in that world and not imbibe its poison? I have a friend who sends his kid to a very Orthodox day school in Detroit, and you have to sign a pledge to put your kid in that school that you won't have a television in the house. Because the attitude is, television is corrupt. Only Torah is pure. That's a segregationist idea, an isolationist idea. Rabbi Yehuda stands for something more integrated. Something more integrated. Not just integrated, but what he's saying is very interesting. We possess Torah. We possess God's truth. But Torah does not exhaust all the truth in the world. God gave us truth, but God didn't teach us how to build roads, or lay out marketplaces, or build bridges. That the Romans know how to do. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I can live with these Romans. I don't have to imbibe their morality. I can travel on their roads. I can drink water from their aqueducts. I can do business in their marketplaces. Rabbi Yossi stays silent. He's not sure. He's not sure. He has internet in his house, and he watches what his kids are looking at online. And he says, I just don't know. Yes, you can get online, and there's all kinds of great information and great resources online. But there's also a great deal of pornography, both sexual pornography and every other kind, political pornography. And I'm just not sure you can share the world with the Romans. Rabbi Shimon, who was the Talmid Mufak, who was the great student of Rabbi Akiva, who was traumatized by the destruction, the brutal murder of his teacher, he's just angry. He says, no, you can't. All that they made to serve themselves. They worship themselves. Everything the Romans make is an emblem of idolatry. Right? They lay out streets to settle prostitutes, baths to pamper themselves, bridges to levy tolls. You can't share the world in any way with such a people. Rabbi Shulweiss, my teacher, used to tell a story. He went to a neurologist for a problem once, and the guy says, it's interesting, I'm going to treat you with a machine which is called a Mengele machine. It turns out that Dr. Mengele, you've heard of him, actually made certain advances in neurology, and there are certain procedures named for him. Shulweiss said, no thank you, I'd rather suffer. But the question is, can a culture so ugly produce anything that's redeemable? That's the question. Rabbi Shimon says, no. Don't touch anything. Even the stuff that looks benign, don't touch it. You cannot touch it without imbibing their moral poison. So what happens? There's a kid named Judah who's learning with them, and he goes and blabs to the Romans. He actually tells everybody he knows, and eventually gets to the Romans, and the Romans put out a claim. They say, Yehuda, who acclaimed us, shall be acclaimed. He becomes the Nasi. Yossi, who remains silent, shall be exiled to Sepphoris. He's on house arrest in Sepphoris. Don't grieve too much. Sepphoris is Capernaum. It's right up against the Galil. It's like being in house arrest in Lake Tahoe for the rest of your life. There's worse fates. And Shimon, who vilified us, him we're going to put to death. They put a contract out in Rabbi Shimon's life. So Rabbi Shimon and his son hid out in the Beis Midrash. They hid out in the house of study. Every day Rabbi Shimon's wife would bring him a bread and a jug of water, which way they sustained themselves. Now wait a minute. If the Romans put out a contract on your life and you're a rabbi, where do you go to hide? You hide in the Beis Midrash? They'll never look for a rabbi there. So someone once said, yeah, because they all look alike. They won't know which one is him. No. Why is he hiding in the Beis Midrash? Why is he hiding in the Beis Midrash? That's the worst place to hide. That's the first place they're going to go look for him. Why is he hiding in the Beis Midrash? Come on, why is he hiding there? Because he's not worried about the Romans' contract on his life. He's worried about what happens to his soul. He's much more worried. He's not worried they're going to kill him. He's worried that he's going to become like them. And the one pure place in this world where Torah reigns is the Beis Midrash, is the academy, where you can study Torah all day long and the world does not intervene. With only one small problem. You are still a body in space, and the Romans control the space. You still have to eat and drink. So what's his connection to the material world? His wife. She brings him the food, and she brings him water. But that's a problem, because they could get to him through her. So he says to his son, she's vulnerable, let's go hide someplace else. And he leaves the Beis Midrash, and they go to a cave. And they hide in a cave. And a miracle occurs, a carob tree and a well. So you can use a little imagination. If there's a miracle, what does that tell you? What does that tell you about God? That God's looking out for them, which God approves of their choice. And a miracle, a tree and a well, does that sound familiar to anybody? That's the Garden of Eden, at least in Rabbi Shimon's eyes. So what happens? Listen to the following image. They removed their garments and sat up to their necks in sand and studied all day, and it was time to daven. They'd put their garments back on, wrap themselves in a tallis and daven, and then take their garments off and go back into sand. So if they removed their garments and buried themselves up to their neck in the sand, and you walked into the cave, what would you see? 2 talking heads. This is Rebbe Shimon's idea. If the Romans control the material world, and the material world is so corrupt by Roman evil, then I have to separate myself from the material world. The only way to live a pure life, a moral life, is to not participate in that world at all, which means I have to become a talking head. The moment I'm a body, I'm in their world again, you see? What do you call that? A religion of the talking head. It's called monasticism. And now you get a sense of what's really at stake in this discussion. The Romans have destroyed the great rabbis of their generation. And the surviving students of those great rabbis are trying to figure out what is the nature of Jewish spiritual life after the destruction. How can we go on being Jewish? What is the shape and form of being Jewish if this is the way the world is going to treat us, if this is the kind of world it is? And one of the options is Rebbe Shimon's option. Leave the world. Step out of the world, because you can't live in this world without becoming like them. And that's what you most don't want to do. That is your highest aspiration, is to stay away from their kind of evil. Isolate, insulate, get away from them, live a different life. Anyone ever been to Williamsburg, Brooklyn? Anyone ever been to Mea Sharim? Anyone ever been to Bnei Brak? Welcome to Rebbe Shimon land. To sit in yeshiva all day, 12, 15, 18 hours a day with holy books, and not have anything to do with the world outside, that's someone's ideal of how you respond after trauma. And it's not an accident that that's Rebbe Shimon's choice after the trauma of seeing his teacher destroyed. And that's a generation of Jews today after the trauma of the Shoah. If Hitler could come out of that world, I don't want to breathe the same air of that world. I don't want to drink the same water of that world. I will isolate myself to whatever extent. And it's interesting that the women make a living for that community, because again, it's the women who are the connection to the material world, but that's minimized. That's Rebbe Shimon's option. And the rabbis are asking themselves the question, is that what Judaism should look like in the face of destruction? And that could have been Judaism. We would have been a monastic people, build monasteries, become monks and nuns, live far away from the real world, from the material world, from the world of work and family and community and politics. Have nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that world. That's Rebbe Shimon. They dwell in the cave 12 years. There's all kinds of reasons why 12. And then the prophet Eliyahu comes and says, somebody tell the son of Yochai that Caesar is dead and the contract's been lifted off his head. Come out wherever you are. Ali, oxen free. Come on out. The next image is beautiful. So they went out and they saw people plowing and sowing, planting, growing food, building lives in the real world. And Rebbe Shimon exclaims, these men forsake life eternal and engage in life in the world. Whatever they cast their eyes on was immediately incinerated. That's a beautiful metaphor for what we call in English judgmentalism. Anyone here have a young teenager at home? Kid rolls his eyes and says, whatever. If the kid could look at you and burn you up, that's what he would want to do. It's this notion that anything I see is just not worthy of being there. Whizzz, whizzz, gone. And then a voice comes from heaven and says, this is the most important line in the text, have you come out to destroy my world? Return to your cave. Now, that's the most important vignette in the whole story. Listen again. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer come out of the cave. And what do they see people doing? What are people doing? Are they sinning? Are they worshiping idols? Are they committing adultery? What are they doing? They're planting food. They're growing food. They're living in the world. But for Rabbi Shimon, that's not enough, because for Rabbi Shimon, what the trauma of seeing his teachers destroyed has done is divide the world. You divide life eternal from life in the world. You divide heaven from earth, soul from body, us from them, spirituality from materiality. And for Rabbi Shimon, you have to make a choice. You can only live on one side or the other. Either you devote your life to faith, spirituality, the life of heaven, or you devote yourself to materiality and sin. And that's the only choice. Make up your mind. He sees no connection. He sees them as opposites. And then God comes and says what? And God here isn't God, obviously, because this is a story written by Rabbi. The tradition decides that can't be the way. That cannot be the way we are Jews in the world. That's not the way. That's not how we're going to respond to the catastrophe. So God comes and says, look at God's answer. Have you come to destroy what? My world? Go back to your cave. My world is a world of people growing food, people raising families, people building communities, people healing the sick, people teaching children, people making life in the world and living a holiness that unites the two, not divides. It unites the two, doesn't divide. What does God say? Come out, have you destroyed my world? Go back to your cave. In my world, you must bring spirituality and materiality together. In my world, you must bring body and soul together. In my world, you must bring heaven and earth together. In my world, you must bring us and them together. You cannot disjoin them and separate them and isolate them. That's not my world, says God. So Rabbi Shimon goes back in the cave for another year to think about that. Takes him a year to think about it. And then he comes out. There's a little vignette about why he comes out. And they say, okay, it's time to come out. And then there's a little ending. Now, whenever rabbis write stories that are too good, there's 3 endings to this story, right? So this is only one of them. There's 2 others. You come back another night, I'll teach you the others. But here's the ending that's the most famous one. It was Erev Shabbos when they come out. And they see an old guy, a zaken. Whenever you see a zaken in rabbinic literature, that's God. He's running around the world. And what's he doing? He's carrying 2 bunches of hadas, 2 bunches of fragrant branches, incense. And they stop him and say, "Vus is dus? What are you doing?" That's Persian for "what are you doing?" Right? And the guy says, "It's for Shabbos, lichvod Shabbos. It's for Shabbat. I'm bringing sweet-smelling branches to my table so that my home is redolent, is filled with perfume on Shabbos." They say, okay, fine, but why not? Why 2? Why not 1? 1 should be enough. No, how big is your house, And his answer is no, 2, because there's 2 commandments to make Shabbos. Remember the Shabbat and observe the Shabbat. Shaborat the Shabbat, Zachorat the Shabbos, right? And Rabbi Shimon says, how wonderful that the people of Israel, how precious are the commandments to the people of Israel, and they are rectified. And they find peace. Quickly, how does that end? Mitzvah. What is a mitzvah? You do a mitzvah with your body. You visit a sick friend physically with your body. You feed the sick. You feed the hungry with your body. You raise the fallen with your body. You give tzedakah with your body. You even pray with your body. You do a mitzvah with your body, but for a spiritual intention. It's mitzvah, which is the technology the rabbis gave us to live a life of spirituality in the material world, so that body and soul, heaven and earth come together as one. And you don't have to live in a cave. But if you do want to live in a cave, if you do say, look, give me a little bit of cave. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard world. Give me a little bit. Let me live. So God's okay. I tell you what, 1 day out of 7, you can go to the cave. 1 day out of 7, you can retreat from the world of economics and politics and power and division and hierarchy and live in the Garden of Eden. And that day is called Shabbos. Then Saturday night comes, you make Havdalah, you go back to work, because I need you in the world to make heaven and earth one. This was the discussion that set the path for what we called Judaism after the destruction of the Holy Temple in the first century. It's time to read the story of that destruction. The first destruction in 586, the second destruction in the year 70. You'll find it in the book of Echa, in the booklet. Once again, thank you to Rabbi Laufer and Rabbi Schuldenfrei for joining us, and let's please do this again. Everyone have a booklet? We have 5 readers, right? So Nina is reading chapter 1. Samuel's reading chapter 2. Who has chapter 3? Yael has chapter 3. Who has chapter 4? Joel has chapter 4. And who has chapter 5? Chapter 5, Evan. Good. Okay. I'm going to ask you, please, those of you reading, if you'll come up to the front. You can sit either on a chair or on the floor. Use the mic so our friends at home can hear us. You can stay where you are now. And when your turn is, come on up, okay? You can take off your mask when you're reading up here. Just don't breathe on a rabbi you love, okay?
Come on up. I don't know if I should take my glasses off or not. I see better sometimes with them off. Or with them on. I think off. Okay. Echa yashva Adat ha'ir rabatihan haita ke'almana rabati vagoyim sarati bamdinot haita lamas bachotiv ke balayla edimata alecheya in laminachem mikol oaveha kol reha bagduva hayula leoevim galta Yehuda meoni umerov avodah hihi yashva vagoyim lo matzah manoach kol rodfea hisiguha ben hametzarim darchei Tzion avelot מבלי באי מועד כל שעריה שוממים כהניה ננחים בתולותיה נגות והימלה היו צריה לראש אויביה שלו כי אדוני הוגה על רוב פשעיה עולליה הלכו שבי לפני צר. ויצא מבת ציון כל הדרה היו שריה כאיילים לא מצאו מרעה והלכו ולא כוח לפני רודף. זוכרה ירושלים ימי עוניה ומרודיה כל מחמודיה אשר היו מימי קדם בנפול עמה ביצר, ואין עוזר לה. ראו הצרים, שחקו על משפטיה. חטא חוטאה ירושלים, על כן נתהייתה. כל מכבדיה הזילוה, כי ראו ערוותה. גם היא ננחה ותשוב אחור. וטומאתה בשוליה, לא זוכרה אחריתה. ועטרת פלאים אין מנחם לה. ראה אדוני את עוני, כי הגדיל אויב. ידו פרסר על כל מחמתיה. כי ראתה גויים באו מקדשה, אשר ציוותה לא יבוא וקהל לך. כל המננחים מבקשים לחם, נתנו מחמדיהם, באוכל אשיב נפש. ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה. לא עליכם כל עוברי דרך, הביטו ראו. אם יש מחוב כמחובי, אשר עולה לי. אשר הוגה אדוני ביום חרונה פה. ממרום שלח אש בעצמותי בירדנה. פרסת רשת לרגלי, השיבני אחור. נתנני שוממה, כל היום דבר. נזכר עול פשעי בידו, יסתרגו עלו על צווארי, הכשיל כוחי. נתנני אדוני בידי לא חלקום. סילח כל אבירי אדוני בקרבי, קרא עלי מועד לשבור בחורי. גד דרך אדוני לבתולת בת יהודה. הללה אני בוכייה, איני יורדה מים, כי רחק ממני, מנחם משיב נפשי. היו בני שוממים, כי גבר אויב. פרסה ציון בידיה, אין מנחם לה. ציווה אדוני ליעקב סביבה בצרה. הייתה ירושלים לנידה ביניהם. Tzaddik hu, Adonai keep you mariti. Shimona kol hamim, Urehu machovi, Betulotai uvachurai alchu vashevi. Karati lemahavai, Hemarimuni, Koanai uskenai ba'ir gavau. Ki bikshu ochel lamo, vayashivu et nafsham. Rei Adonai ki tzar li, me'ai chamarmaru, nepach libi, bekirbi, ki maro mariti, michut shikla cherev babait kamavet. Shamu, shamu, ki nenachan ani, ein menachem li, kol hoyevai, shamurati sasu, ki ata sita, eveta yom karata, vayu chamoni. Tavo choratam lefanecha, ve'olelamo, kasher holalta, li al kol peshai, ki rabot anchotai, velibi davai.
Alas, alas, the Lord in his wrath has shamed fair Zion, has cast down from heaven to earth the majesty of Israel. He did not remember his footstool on his day of wrath. The Lord has laid waste without pity all the habitations of Jacob. He has raised in his anger fair Judah's strongholds. He has brought low in dishonor the kingdom and its leaders. In blazing anger, he has cut down all the might of Israel. He has withdrawn his right hand in the presence of the foe. He has ravaged Jacob like flaming fire, consuming on all sides. He bent his bow like an enemy, poised his right hand like a foe. He slew all who delighted the eye. He poured out his wrath like fire in the tent of fair Zion. The Lord has acted like a foe. He has laid waste Israel, laid waste all her citadels, destroyed her strongholds. He has increased within fair Judah, mourning and moaning. He has stripped his booth like a garden. He has destroyed his tabernacle. The Lord has ended in Zion festival and Sabbath. In his raging anger, he has spurned king and priest. The Lord has rejected his altar, disdained his sanctuary. He has handed over to the foe the walls of his citadels. They raised a shout in the house of the Lord as on a festival day. The Lord resolved to destroy the wall of fair Zion. He measured with a line, refrained not from bringing destruction. He has made wall and rampart to mourn. Together they languish. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has smashed her bars to bits. Her king and her leaders are in exile. Instruction is no more. Her prophets too receive no vision from the Lord. Silent sit on the ground the elders of fair Zion. They have strewn dust on their heads and girded themselves with sackcloth. The maidens of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with tears. My heart is in tumult. My being melts away over the ruin of my poor people. as babes and sucklings languish in the squares of the city. They keep asking their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" as they languish like battle-wounded in the squares of the town, as their life runs out in their mothers' bosoms. What can I take as witness or liken to you, fair Jerusalem? What can I match with you to console you, O fair maiden Zion? For your ruin is vast as the sea. Who can heal you? Your seers prophesied to you delusion and folly. They did not expose your iniquity so as to restore your fortunes, but prophesied to you oracles of delusion and deception. All who pass your way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their head at fair Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called perfect in beauty, joy of all the earth? All your enemies jeer at you. They hiss and gnash their teeth and cry, "We've ruined her. Ah, this is the day we hoped for. We have lived to see it." The Lord has done what he purposed, has carried out the decree that he ordained long ago. He has torn down without pity. He has let the foe rejoice over you, has exalted the might of your enemies. Their heart cried out to the Lord, "O wall of fair Zion, shed tears like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no respite, your eyes no rest." Arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the watches. Pour out your heart like water in the presence of the Lord. Lift up your hands to him for the life of your infants who faint for hunger at every street corner. See, O Lord, and behold, to whom you have done this. Alas, women eat their own fruit, their newborn babes. Alas, priest and prophet are slain in the sanctuary of the Lord. Prostrate in the streets lie both young and old. My maidens and youths are fallen by the sword. You slew them on your day of wrath. You slaughtered without pity. You summoned, as on a festival, my neighbors from round about. On the day of the wrath of the Lord, none survived or escaped. Those whom I bore and reared, my foe has consumed.
אני הגבר העוני בשבט עברתו, אותי נהג ויולך חושך ולא אור, אך בי ישוב יפוך ידו כל היום. בי לבשרי ואורי שיבר עצמותיי, בנה עלי ויקף ראש ותלאה, במחשכים הושיבני כמתי עולם. גדר בעדי ולא אצא, הכביד נחושתי, גם כי אזעק ואשבע, סתם תפילתי. גדר דרכי בגזית, נתיבותי איבה. דוב עורב הוא לי, ארי במסתרים, דרכי שורר ויפשחני, שמני שומם. דרך קשתו ויציבני, כמטרה לחץ. הביא בכליותי בני אשפתו, הייתי שחוק לכל עמי, נגינתם כל היום. השביעני במרורים, קירבני לענה. ויגרס בחצץ שיני, הכפישני באפר, ותזנח משלום נפשי, נשיתי טובה, ואומר עבד נצחי, ותאכלתי מאדוני. זכר עוני ומרודי, לענה וראש, זכור תזכור ותשיח עלי נפשי. זאת אשיב אל ליבי, על כן אוכיל. חסדי אדוני כי לא תמנו, כי לא חלו רחמיו. חדשים לבקרים רבה אמונתך. חלקי אדוני אמרה נפשי, על כן אוכיל לו. טוב אדוני לקובב, לנפש תדרשנו. טוב ויחיל ודומם, לתשועת אדוני. טוב לגבר כיסא, עול בינו רב. ישב בדד ודום, כי נטל עליו. ייתן בעפר פיהו, אולי יש תקווה. ייתן למכהו לחי, יסבע בחרפה. כי לא יזנח לעולם אדוני, כי אם הוגיו וריחם קרוב חסדיו. כי לא ינע מליבו, ויגע בני איש.
ונקה תחת רגליו כל אסירי הארץ, להטות משפט גבר נגד פני עליון, לעבד אדם בריבו, אדוני לא ראה. מי זה אמר ותהי, אדוני לא ציווה, מפי עליון לא תצא הרות והטוב. מה יתונן אדם חי, גבר או חטאה? נחפשה דרכינו ונחקורה, ונשובה עד אדוני. נישא לבבינו אל כפיים, אל בשמיים. אנחנו פשענו ומרינו, אתה לא סלחת. סקותה ויף תרדפנו, הרגת לא חמלת. סקותה ויענן לך, מעבור תפילה. שכי ומעוז תשימנו בקרב העמים. פצו עלינו פיהם, כל אויבינו. פחד ופחד היה לנו, השט והשבר. פלגי מים תרדני, על שבר בת עמי. איני נגרע ולא תדמה, מעין הפוגות. עד ישקיף וירא אדוני מן השמיים. איני עוללה לנפשי מכל בנות עירי. צוד צדוני כציפור, אויבי חינם. שמתו בבור חיה, וידו אבן בי. צפו מים על ראשי, אמרתי נגזרתי. קראתי שמך אדוני, מבור תחתיות. קולי שמעת אל תעלה מצנך, לרווחתי, לשבתי. קרבת ביום אקראך, אמרת אל תירא. רבת אדוני ריבי נפשי, גאלת חיה. ראית אדוני אהבתי, שבת משפטי. ראית כל נקמתם, כל מחשבותם לי. שמעת חרפתם אדוני, כל מחשבותם עלי. שפתי קמי והגיונם, Ali kol hayom. Shiftam v'kimatam habita ani manginatam. Tashiv lahem gemul Adonai k'ma'aseh yedehem. Titen lahem maginat lev ta'alatcha lahem. Tirdof be'afet hashmidem mitachat shmei Adonai.
Chapter 4. The translation that I'm reading is not the same as the one that you have in front of you, but you can follow along. Obviously, the meaning is the same. How, dun-dimmed gold, clinkons corrupted, scattered sacred stones in courtyards' copes, everywhere. How, dear Zion brood, weighed good as gold, now like loamy pots, artifice of artisan. Even jackals proffer breasts to suckle young. My dearest kin is cruel now, a gluttonous Badlands ostrich. Sucklings' desiccated tongues to palates glued, younglings yearn for bread, to them no hand outstretched. Who gobbles dainties, languish now in streets, whom scarlet swaddled now clutch heaps of trash. It's grown, my dear kin's sin, blacker than Sodom's, the city spun spontaneously, though not by human hands. More pure than snow were Jerusalem's princes, more sunny white than milk, blush ruddier than rubies, bodies sapphire solid. But now, ash black their visage, unrecognizable, anemic skin hangs loose and dry as bark. Happier the sword slain than the hunger wasted, pierced pining for the fatty field's fruits. Nestling women's hands have boiled their babes for food, my people shattered. Almighty's spent his frenzy, poured his blazing nostrils' heat, kindled flames in Zion, gobbled up the city's base. Incredulous the kings of earth, the denizens of earth as well, that enemy and foe should ford Jerusalem's gates, for prophets' sins, for priests' misdeeds, for hands incarnadine with blameless blood. The blind, as bats, would bumble through the streets, draped in defiling blood, untouchable in their crusted cloaks. Surutame, strangers shout, off, away, don't touch me, vile vagrants. And so the nations gave notice. Almighty's sundered them. No longer has love left for those who'd spurned the priests, calumniated patriarchs. Straining eyes still sought salvation, all in vain. We, waiting, watched. For what? For those helpless to help. They stalked our steps. We couldn't walk the streets. The close draws close. Our lifetime leaves. Our close has come. Swifter our pursuers than welkin-wafted eagles, hunting us on hills towards brushland ambuscades. Our inmost breath, once heaven loved, gasps trapped. We'd thought that in Yah's shade we'd prosper among the peoples. O you, dear Zion brood, your sin is past. He'll exile you no more. But you, Edom, who dwells in farthest Uts, He's seen your sin. He's tracked your trespasses. Jubilate and joy, Edom, who dwells in farthest Uts. To you as well the cup shall pass. You'll drink and spew it too. Thank you.
זכור אדוני מחיה לנו, הביטה וראה את חרפתנו. נחלתנו נפח לזרים, בתי בתינו לנחרים. יתומים היינו ויהנה, ואמותינו כאלמנות. מימינו וכסף שתינו, עצנו במחיר יבואו, על צווארנו נרדפנו, יגענו ולא חונה לנו, מצרים נתנו יד, אשור לסבוע לכם. אבותינו חטאו ואינם, ואנחנו אבנותיכם סבלנו, עבדים משלו בנו, פורקן מידם. בנפשנו נביא לחמנו, מפני חרב המדבר. הורינו כתנור נחמרו, מפני זלעפותך. נשים בציון עינו, בתולות בערי יהודה. שרים בידם ניתנו, פני זקנים לא נדרו. בחורים תיכון נשאו, ונערים בעץ כשלו. זקנים משער שבתו, בחורים מנגינתם. שבת משוש ליבנו, נפח לאבל מחולנו. נפלה עטרת ראשנו, אוי נא לנו כי חטאנו. על זה היד אבל ליבנו, על אלה החשו עינינו. על הר ציון ששמם, שועלים חילחו בו. אתה אדוני לעולם תשב, כיסאך לדור ודור. לנצח תשכחנו, תעזבנו לאורך ימים. השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה חדש ימינו. כקדם כי עם מעוז מסתנו, קצפת עלינו עד מאוד. השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם. השיבנו אדוני אליך,
who joined us tonight. Thank you to our readers, all of you. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you to Rabbi Laufer, Rabbi Schildenfrei. Thank you to Cantor Aronoff for helping me put this together, and Alana Zimmerman for making all this possible tonight, and to Hunter, wherever you are, thank you for this stream. We want to wish everyone, I guess you don't say a pleasant Tisha B'Av, but a meaningful Tisha B'Av. Tomorrow morning for Valley Beth Shalom, Minyan at 8:30 here, in person and online on Facebook and YouTube. Will include a reading of sorry? All right, 8:30 here in the morning, 9 o'clock at Adat Ariel. We're doing Mincha at 2 o'clock with Talis and Tefillin. 7 p.m. We're going to do another one at 6. So let's see. So Adat has it 9 o'clock and 7 p.m. VBS has 8:32 and 6. If that doesn't meet your schedule, I can't help you. Sorry? 6 is only online. Very good. Please put the booklets on the table. Thank you for being with us tonight. Be very careful getting home. Thanks so much. That was beautiful.